In this video, we're going to convert a Figma design over to Editor X. As part of this process, we'll take the style guide and rebuild that, including the typography and colors. Then we'll take a look at the header as well as the hero section and other sections and put it all together. Once we're done, we'll compare the original Figma design with Editor X to see how we went. Let's just jump straight into it. The design we're looking at is from the Front-End Mentor group. I'm going to add a link in the description below, but you can find it under challenges and it's called Suit Landing Page. It's a simple design with a header as well as a hero section, another section here about a testimonial, as well as a footer. But it also comes with a lot of other stuff like a style guide that we can implement and other different perspectives for pages and viewports. Now let's load up Editor X to begin. I'll start by heading to Google and searching Editor X. I'm going to go to the website and I'm already logged in, so this will take me straight to the dashboard. Here I'm going to create a new site. And for this new site, I'm going to select Editor X as the platform which I'm going to use. This will load up the Editor X platform on a new template. For the template, I'm going to select Other, and I'm going to start off with a blank canvas, so we can get started with this design. This design right now needs a logo, so that's the very first thing I'm going to start with. But currently we don't have any assets. Figma allows you to export assets by simply selecting on the asset you want and selecting on the bottom right the asset export type. Here I'm exporting the logo as an SVG. What we're going to do is double click on this current logo and upload this SVG asset to the library for media. Here we can select the asset to use, and this should replace the logo placement holder that we previously had. Now, before we get any further, I'm thinking that we should have a look at our style guide for this website design because all the colors, assets, and typography are here. In Editor X, we can open up the style guide, which allows us to select our typography and colors. And I'm going to go through the background color to start off with and update the hexadecimal value for that in here. We can see that that has taken priority, and we can actually go through each one of these values and replace the existing color here in Editor X. So I'm just going to go through this and update the black color here, which we use primarily for our text and fonts, and then go through all the other shades as well. Once we've done that, we can also go through the colors for the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, which we have options here as well. Moving on, it's time to set the typography. Now with the typography, we do have a custom font in here. It's called Epilogue, and what it is just a regular Roboto-like looking font, but it is slightly different and a variation of what we're used to. Now for this font itself, if we head over to typography and try to change the font size as well as the font type, we'll find that Epilogue isn't actually listed in here. So what we're going to have to do is actually download and upload this font into Editor X. Now this font is actually located on Google Fonts, so we can head over to Google Fonts here and we can search it up and then select to download it and its variants. We want the normal version as well as the bold version because these are the two types we're currently using on the design for this website. So let's select these two, and then on the bottom right we can select to download them. Once we've downloaded them, they'll be zipped up, so we'll want to unzip them. And now we can head back to our style guide here and select the font family and upload a custom font family. We can select the folder that we're currently uploading from and then select the font type we want to upload as well. This will take a few seconds while it checks the font and adds it to the library. Moving on now, we can utilize these font families and set them for our headers as well as our paragraphs. You'll want to double check the style guide and have a look at the typography rules for the header 1, 2, and 3 to make sure that you're following the font sizes in terms of its heights by pixels, as well as its style of whether it's bold or italics, and its font family in case it changes from header to paragraph. Here I'm going to go through each type and apply them to the proper text paragraph styles. Now our style guide is more or less complete inside of EditorX, replicating the style guide that we have here in the design. This includes the colors that we'll be using as well as the typography. We haven't yet added the button designs, but we'll add these in custom later on in our process of designing the homepage, which we can move on to now. For the homepage, we can take a look at the first few elements in the header, which include this button here to request for beta access. We're going to recreate this button here inside of EditorX by simply selecting the button option here in our elements and dragging it here to the top right of the design. Right now, the design of this button isn't exactly the same as in our design file, so what we're going to do is customize it. I've noticed that the borders of it are very curved, basically like half a circle, so what I'm going to do is change the borders to have a border radius of about 10 pixels. It also doesn't have a background. Instead, it uses a line around, which is essentially a border. So I'm going to apply the same sort of a border with about 1 pixel and make the background 0 opacity. With that done, our button is now looking a little bit more standard in terms of the design, but there are still a few elements which haven't been updated. Let's update the text itself to say request beta access, and once we do, we notice that the button isn't the right size, so let's actually expand it out a little bit. The next thing I noticed is that the button itself, the border on it, doesn't seem thick enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the border to have 2 pixels, and that seems to have looked a lot better in comparison to our design file. We also notice that the typography doesn't use the same font. So here we're going to put that epilogue font once more in, and that's looking much better now. I'm pretty happy with the button design, and I think we can move on to the rest of this header, which I've noticed has a menu here at the top right, which comes with most designs on EditorX. I'm going to remove the menu and then place the button back into the top right, because at this stage of the design, this website is not using a menu. Now with the header done, we can move on to the hero section, which is above the fold, to add in our main hero text as well as image here that we've got in our design file. When designing a hero section, I usually like to go with the most simple elements first and then get more progressively into the more complex elements. Our simple elements here are the text section. So I'm going to copy paste the text section as a header 1 element here into our design for EditorX. And we're going to update the typography here to be a little bit more consistent with the actual design file. The design file only has bold fonts for certain words here, so I'm going to unbold some of the words here. And I'm also going to expand out this section so that the width is more or less the same as in the design as well. Now, in terms of the sizing, I want the docking to be assigned from the very top. Right now, this section actually might be a little bit too small, and the actual sizing from the left and the right might not be wide enough, but I'll play around with that a little bit later in the design. The next thing I need to do is add the next paragraph in here. So let's actually add a little bit more space here at the bottom of our design and add in some typography for this text for the description below the hero text. So I'll add in a paragraph section here, and I'm going to place it below this hero text, and then I'm going to update and copy paste the text that we have from our design file. Next, I have a look at where the lines are breaking in on what specific words, because this gives us an indication of the width of this section as well. So I've placed that in to be more or less exactly the same as our design, and now we can actually replicate the button here which goes below this text. Now this button uses the same design that we've had at the top right of our header. The only difference is that we need to invert the colors. So rather than having a border on the outline, here I'm going to fill in the entire button with a background color, and then instead I'm going to make the text a white variant, essentially the same as our background color. Now this section for the text elements, which are the easiest usually to add, are complete. We can move on to adding the image here in this design file, which is this phone with this background gradient for the color of this yellow and purple. So I'm going to export this element like I previously did for the logo, and then I'm going to place in an image here, and this image I'm going to upload that gradient with the phone into this library. Let's actually drag and drop this image in from our file here, and then we can apply to use it here inside of this image I just dropped into EditorX. Right now the perspective of this image isn't correct, so I'm gonna play around with the sizing so that it's more or less the same as in our design. If we have a look at the design, we'll also notice subtle changes to the image where while it has borders, the borders are slightly curved. So I'm going to select the border section here for this image and apply the same sort of a curve, which I think is between 10 to 15 pixels. I'm going to roughly guess this and then I'll play around with it by eye. But it looks to be about 15 pixels, so I'm going to increase it a little bit so that it's the same as our design. There is this line above the solutions word, and this line is actually a shape, an SVG shape. We can add an SVG shape by selecting the element's shapes here, and then selecting to upload this media. Once again, I'm just going to drag and drop it here into the media options, and then select to use it for our shapes. This shape sometimes comes in a varied size, so what I'm going to do is actually increase the shape size to be just about the same size as our solutions word here that we have in our design file. Now it's a simple manner of moving it across to be around the exact same size as well as height and position as we had originally. Once we've done that, we can move all the elements into position so that they overlap a little bit here, the same as our design. And a trick to do this is by having a look at what letter they overlap on. We'll also notice that the arrangement for the text is below the image. So I'm going to actually align it and move it above the image. That way it's going to be the same as our design. Now we can also double check the positioning of all the elements such as the image here, where it is positioned a little bit above and below the text as well as button. And the aspect ratio of it essentially gives a little bit more room for this text to exist in that area. It's just overlapping to the start of that radial gradient of the yellow above the mobile phone. So I'm going to move around the elements so that they're positioned a little bit better in terms of the respective positioning of the design file. Of course, this also means updating our header so that it is consistent with the rest of the design. I'm going to move it in a little bit, essentially giving it a smaller container and less width while it has more padding on the left and right hand side. But I think this is more genuine in terms of how it originally looked in terms of that design. I'm now going to move on to the right hand side here where we have some statistics for this hero section. I'm going to add these in as header sections, and these header sections should be about the right size comparing with our design file. Header 1 is slightly too large, so I'm going to actually change this to be a header 2 element. And I'm also going to position it to the left hand side here to be aligned from the top, similar to our A super solution text. Now I can add the text below this statistic. It looks to be like a very small piece of text, like a header 6 maybe. And this is the word companies. It's also in all caps, so I'm going to reword this and place it here below. Now this element here is more or less the same as all the other statistics. So once we get this correct and group it, we can copy paste it to reuse for all our other sections. So here I'm playing around with what typography looks correct in terms of our design file, and it looks like the actual text paragraph 1 is pretty much on point. I do need to change the color so that it's not black, but instead this off black gray sort of a color, and this seems to be just about right in terms of our UI. And now I'm simply going to copy and paste each one of these statistics below and position them correctly. With that done, we've more or less completed the hero section. We can review it to have a look at what it looks like in comparison to the design file, even zooming out a little bit to make sure that it all is consistent. I like to do this every now and then just in case I missed out on anything. In this case, I feel that the logo is a little bit too big in comparison to the user interface design. So after adjusting it a little bit, I can move on to this next section here, which says it just works. I'll create a brand new section in Editor X as a blank section, and I'm going to expand it out a little bit so that it has about the same amount of room as this section here. Now the one thing that I've noticed with this section is that we've got an image that sort of almost overlaps and goes above the actual content with this line and the typography text on the right side. So let's actually expand out this section to make sure that we have room for all of it, and then start adding in the assets that we'll be using. The first thing that I'll want to add is this box or this container, which all the content will be inside. So I'll select to add a container in, and I'll make sure that I size it correctly in terms of our design. Here I'm going to adjust the width to be in line with all our text elements on the left and right hand sides. And then I'm going to also update the background color to be that dark background color that we're using in our design file. We also have a slight border radius of around 15 pixels here, which I'll apply. And I think this looks just about right. Now we can add in some of the images and the text. So let's select to add an image, and I want to add the person in here. So I'm going to select to upload a media file, and then I'm going to head into Figma and select to export him. I'm going to export him as a PNG so that he has a transparent background. And I'm going to select to use this as my image. Right now the sizing is all wrong, as well as the positioning. I want to position this image on the bottom left, and I want to make sure that the aspect ratio basically keeps him all in view. Now the other thing is I want to move his head above the container. Now this means that we need a little bit of a negative margin, and sometimes it's a little bit tricky to do this. So what I like to do is often play around with the elements to make sure that it is positioned with an offset, and then resize the box to make sure that we can still have him look like he's coming out of the frame of that container. If we wanted to take mobile responsiveness into consideration, we would change this container into a grid. But for the time being, I just want to create a simple design that would be working on a desktop. So let's have a look at adding the text elements in next. Now, for these text elements, they're slightly different. So we could manually set what they are. But it's always best to follow the typography styles that are currently set, because they'll adjust accordingly if we ever need to make any changes. So here I'm going to select a paragraph 2, and since we're not using that primary color of a dark background, we're going to actually select to use the white text here so that it fits in and is accessible as well as visible on this black container box. Now once that's done, I've also adjusted the font weights, because if we look closely to our design file, it just is without bold while the word works is in bold. Now that that's done, I can move this into position and add in the next section here, which is almost like the quote below this main heading. Now for this quote, I'm going to simply copy and paste the text below it, and then I'm going to update the styling once again to use the paragraph text that we have here. We're going to change the color here to be white so that it's visible on this dark container. And the other element to this is that we're going to resize it and also change the line height, because currently the line height is about 1, and in order for this website to remain true to its design, we need it to be bumped up to about 2 or 2.5. Once we have a look at this, we should be able to judge whether it is the same as our design, and sometimes it's good to flick back and forth between the design file and the content itself to make sure that it is respecting that. Now we can move on to the final part here, which we can copy paste the text of the name as well as the company. And this is just a header 4, which is quite small, all in caps, as well as this next section here, which is the company, which is almost even smaller, and the text is a little bit off-white so that it has very low visual hierarchy priority. I'll move it into place just below the name. And then I'll just adjust the spacing generally for all the items so that they're a little bit more center inside of this container. Jumping back to the design file, we have one more element here, which is this line that sort of links between the person and the header content. Now this again is a shape, so I'm going to select the shape element here, and I'm going to upload this shape, which I've exported as an SVG. Once again, we'll place this in and resize it and move it just between the person and the text here. And we can double check the design file here so that it looks pretty much the same. And here it's actually quite small, but it's sort of positioned just between his shoulder and the two text elements of the header and the paragraph. With that done, I'm pretty happy with the design of this container. I just think that it needs to be resized a little bit, so I'm going to move around some of the elements so that I can do this. Next up, I want to select all the text elements and I'll stack them just so that they stay in the same sort of a grouping, especially when you resize them later or if you resize the viewport. This just makes everything stacked together. Let's also move them a little bit here to the right so there is a little bit more space. And it's almost as if in terms of this container, there's one group here on the left with the image as well as one group here on the right with the text. Later, we can take a look at this container to actually create a column-like design so that it actually does collapse in different viewports. Generally speaking, this section now is finished. We can do some quick checks to have a look at the design file as well as the content we've created, just to make sure that it is staying consistent, but I'm quite happy with that. And I think now it's time to move on to the next section, which is the footer section. And this one is quite simple because it's just a logo on the left-hand side with some social media links on the right-hand side and some text in the middle. So let's actually start on creating that. In terms of the actual text itself, I think I'll keep this copyright text, but I want to grab the logo we have in the header and simply copy paste that here below. I think that's enough to get it up and running. I just think that maybe it needs to be shrunk down a little bit, especially being in the footer, it's not as important. The next thing we can do is add in the social links. There's an element for that, which I'm going to select and just place them here on the bottom right, adhering to the container size, and then probably just rearranging the social icons and removing the ones that we aren't using. With that done, we can now move on to customizing some of the elements that we have here in the footer, which means that we want to update the text that we have, because right now the text is a little bit too dark, and that's about it. We can now do a review of our original design and the design we have in Editor X here, and just double check to make sure we haven't missed anything. And when I'm scrolling through here on our Editor X design, one thing that stands out to me immediately is that we've got this big background here which uses the cream color, which we don't think we've applied here, and we've got also this slight gradient behind our guy here, which I might also put in. So here, what I'm going to do is add in a container, and for this container, I'm going to just place it here, and I want it behind this item over here. So what I'm going to do is arrange to send it to the back, which that seems to have worked. Let's see how much space it has. So it finishes off just at about the phone level, which is here, and it exists with about 100% width. So I think that's good. The only other thing here for this section is that it also needs that same background. So I'm just going to apply it manually instead for this section here. And that creates that. Now the other aspect is this gradient we have behind this guy. So I'm going to export this as an SVG, and let's see if we can just add it in here as maybe an image. Actually, no, because this is an SVG, it'll need to be a shape. So what I'm going to do is select a shape this time, and then I'll select my files, and then I'll select this one over here. So we've got that here. Now I'm going to make this larger, so it's just behind this guy, and then I'm also going to make this guy arranged in front of it. So I'm going to move him forward, and then I'm going to move him forward again, maybe move him to the front, and there we go. So we've got that slight gradient or radial gradient behind, we've got the guy in front, we've got this background as well. And so now we can take a look at our original Figma design over here and have a look at how we've recreated it in terms of Editor X. So far, I'm pretty satisfied with what we've had. We've recreated the header section over here quite well with the logo and the button. In terms of the hero section, we've placed in the hero text with this line perfectly, along with the image and the statistics. I think we could fix up the actual sizing here and positioning of this request a beta text just a little bit higher, but otherwise it's designed quite well. Then we've got this section here, it just works, which again has been replicated quite well. The font sizes could be increased here a little bit, but I think the design right now is simply because we've got more width on this Editor X page, and if we were to shrink this down a little bit, it would be about the same. And finally, we've got the footer here, which has been also replicated quite well. And again, in terms of the width, there is a little bit more spacing here in our Editor X design in comparison to our Figma design, but that's simply because of the viewport being a little bit smaller here in the Figma design file. I hope this gives you a good insight into what it looks like when converting a Figma design file over to Editor X. There'll be lots more videos where we go into things like responsive designs and breakpoints, but that's for the future. Thank you to the Editor X team for supporting this video. I hope you guys hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.